Hello, my name is Maria Raylova. I'm the global librarian here at SCAD Libraries. My role works predominantly with the SCAD Now community. So if anyone is joining us today that is a SCAD Now student, you can think of me as your go-to resource for any research help. Really today, my inspiration for this workshop is from this quote: question everything, learn something, answer nothing. So what I really want to stress today is that idea of type of intellectual curiosity. You really want to be out there and exploring your interests, learning more. And with that last piece, answer nothing, I like to interpret that as never assuming that something is right or that you know the answer right away. So this is really kind of my idea for the workshop today. Really what I'll be going over is that importance of this source evaluation piece of questioning if something is going to be a credible source, if something is going to be a worthwhile source to use for your research. Of course, with that, I'm going to talk too about how to evaluate these sources. There's a lot of different things we can do to try to think critically around this topic and really make sure that we are getting the right information for our projects. And then I have a couple resources that I want to highlight as it relates to this idea around source evaluation. But getting into it, I want to start by just having a little point about why does this matter. Not only is it important to really question everything, like I said, because we want to stay curious, but it's a great way to conduct our research and learn more about what we're interested in. But it's also a very important skill to have for identifying those trustworthy sources. We want to make sure that we're using those credible sources. If we're ever in a class where a professor is specifically asking us for those, scholarly, peer-reviewed sources, we need to make sure we know how to identify that. But really in our day-to-day lives, there's a lot of information out there, and it's getting really increasingly difficult to distinguish between what might be misinformation, what might be something like fake news, propaganda, satire, and what's really the truth out there. And it's not just academics, it's not just people who are posting things on Facebook that can fall victim to this. We really are all susceptible to believing in this false information sometimes. And I have a real world example that I want to go through. I think it's taking a second to load on my slide. But there was a tweet that was circulated a couple years ago about the video game Tetris and what the names of those little shapes were called. And it was a really interesting image that was circulating around Twitter. And you can see from these little tweets here, someone posted that booklet. I found the original instruction booklet for Tetris. And did anyone know that these pieces had names? Someone followed up by posting that Jeopardy did. And I have that little thing pulled up so I can make it bigger for y'all. If we wanted to look at the actual names, you can see one of them is called Orange Ricky. One of them is called Hero, Tiwi, Smash Boy. Really interesting names for these shapes, right? I had no idea that that's what they were called. Seems a little strange. I don't know if anyone else agrees with me that these are really peculiar names for these resources. But Jeopardy thought it would be a cool question. So they actually had their contestants answer this question. I will show you the little slide. It was the 7 rotatable blocks used in this video game, names like Orange Ricky, Hero, Smash Boy, and the person got it right. They said, what is Tetris? They got their points. Jeopardy tweeted about it, and I want to show you the reaction that the Tetris company had, which I think is very funny. So if you are maybe a video game fanatic, maybe this isn't news to you. This came out in 2019. But if you do any other kind of thinking or digging into this topic, I went straight to the source. I saw that Tetris tweeted back at them. They are just regular names. The 7 little shapes are just kind of the symbols that they are. So it's the L shape, the J shape. There's no really kind of silly names like we saw in that original example. So this is something that I wanted to share with y'all because this seems really cool and really kind of interesting. But if you were like me, when you first saw this, you were like, that's really weird. That was a good thing to think of as something that potentially might want to do a little bit of extra digging on, really trying to think about why those might be called that. Where can I find this replicated information anywhere? And it is a thing that, we all fall victim to. Even Jeopardy thought that they saw this tweet and thought it would be an interesting question to have. If we look at these dates, it was originally February of 2019, and Jeopardy had it as a question in October of 2019. So this had circulated for a little bit of time, and no one really thought about fact checking it. So just a little bit of trivia. You can actually correct Jeopardy with this question here. And this is a really fun example in my mind of that idea that if you have a gut reaction to something, even if it is, an academic article, if anything is making some claims or those really catchy headlines, I want you to trust your gut sometimes. I want you to really think to why might something be said that way? Why might something be presented to me in this kind of spin or this type of format? So really thinking critically, whether you're looking at, the news on Twitter, or maybe you are browsing the stacks in the library here at Gen Library. If you see something that you kind of have that gut reaction to, explore it. Really start to question it, really start to look into it more. So that was just a quick real world example I wanted to show y'all. But really the rest of kind of this idea about questioning these resources or questioning this information that you're finding really comes down to how to evaluate these sources. What are things that you can look for, and what are things that are going to distinguish research that you find as a trustworthy source? So if you've ever been to an instruction session with a librarian before, you probably know that we love acronyms. And there are a ton of acronyms that we use to kind of think of this evaluating resources. I have them all up here on the slide. They're really kind of stressing some key points of view. You'll see that we have APART, we have ASAP. Robot is a newer one that's used for kind of more technology and evaluation. And then there's apps as well. Most of these are going to kind of have you think about the same ideas. So you can see that author or authority, ownership, a lot of those kind of topics are going to be within these. It's always about finding that information at its core source. But the other thing around these is thinking about other kind of biases or the purpose of a piece. What is the audience, and who is the intended audience for this? It's really kind of all over the place sometimes when we're thinking about this. So what I wanted to do is really break it down to y'all and get into some of those deep questions we might be asking. So when we're breaking this down, what I really like to do is kind of follow the process of starting kind of at that high level and maybe drilling down a little bit more. So for example, you always want to consider that source. So that's what I'm kind of talking about with the authority piece. Where are you finding this information? Is this something that I saw on Twitter? Is this something that I found through a library catalog? Is this something that my professor shared with me? If you have access to kind of the around information for it, so if you found an article on Twitter and you can get to that source, going to that news site, kind of clicking through, sometimes reading about who is publishing this If they have a mission statement of any kind, that's a great way to kind of get an idea of the type of information they're publishing. A lot of academic journals as well will have these type of missions, or they'll have statements where you can kind of read about their methodology. Sometimes you can even get like their contact information. So that can be a really great way if you do have a lot of questions to kind of figure out more about that source and what their intended purpose is in their writing. That next step is, of course, if you're anything like me, you see those clickbait titles and you really fall for them. I think I clicked on one today about coffee and caffeine consumption. So, you see those little kind of buzzworthy titles and you just want to know more about it. You want to know what's kind of being talked about in that space you're interested in. But I don't know about the amount of times you've been talking to someone and you're like, oh, well, I read this article about, but you really just read the headline. So sometimes you have to read beyond. You have to make sure that you're getting that full picture. Sometimes those headlines can be misleading on purpose to get you to click into it. Sometimes they're really straightforward, so you don't feel like you have to read the article, but you really do want to make sure you're getting that whole story. I think it goes without saying from that slide with all of our acronyms that thinking about the author is very important. Not only the fact that there is an author, sometimes you don't always get that full name of who wrote this article or wrote a blog post or a tweet. So having the ability to check in on that author is really important. So being able to, if it's linkable, click the link, find their bio. Sometimes in academic journals, it'll even have any affiliations they may have if they work at a university. Things like that can be really helpful. But what I like to stress most when we are looking into the author is really looking at their credibility in the field they're talking about. This is when I always like to talk about how I studied library science. So if I was to publish an article about physics or about food science, or honestly, anything outside of my little library realm, I lose my credibility because that's not something I studied. That doesn't mean I can't do research in those other kind of categories, but I do lose a little bit of my credibility in working outside of my field. So if you are finding those blog posts and you're not quite sure if this person is credible, find out maybe their bio, find maybe their LinkedIn page, if they have any sort of internet presence. A lot of the time you can find what they studied. I was actually looking at a blog post in a class when we were looking at images of bees. And we ended up on a blog, and it turns out that the blog was actually by someone who had a PhD in scientific animation. So they were a lot more credible than I thought, just based off of the fact that it was a blog. So you want to do your due diligence around checking up and following up with who is the author to this. The next piece is, of course, you may be familiar with those very long articles that just kind of have links interspersed between them. That's a great sign to do a little bit of rabbit holing. Click on those links, determine if they are supporting what's being said in that article. Also make sure that those links even work. Sometimes I know if you ever have gone to Wikipedia's sources, some of those are dead links. They might be too old, the web pages might be down. So you want to do a little bit of follow-up with going through those links, especially if they're citing something over and over again or something very major to their argument. The same kind of idea around this is checking those dates. So sometimes things get reposted, even though they're not necessarily as relevant anymore. So you want to make sure that, especially when we're looking at news and potentially some of those social media feeds, things can get recycled quite a bit. So pay attention to those dates. They might not be relevant or they might not be as current as we have. But that also goes the same way of if an event just happened and you see it being written about, think about the fact that they might not have all of the information yet, especially if it's something major happening in the world and it's still happening. There's not always going to be as much information as someone might need to write about it. So you need to look at those dates to make sure that you kind of have that idea. One of the most important things too, when we're looking at those news articles or any type of information we're getting from social media, and this kind of goes to that Tetris piece again, is it a joke? Is it satire? I have the Onion as the icon here because that's a very famous newspaper that does satire, but there's a lot more out there. And I'm sure we've all run into those where you kind of can't tell sometimes how serious something might be, and then other times it's so obvious. So you have to be careful if something is potentially a joke. There's a lot of that in the political sphere. There's even a lot of that in the art sphere. I follow a lot of art accounts on Instagram that will post things in a joking manner, but sound very official. So a lot of those sources in their description of their kind of mission statement and things like that will say that they're satire. So you need to, again, follow those other steps to make sure that you are kind of getting the joke, you're in on the joke, and you're not sharing it and potentially spreading that misinformation. Something else that's very important to consider, especially as I've been talking to that gut reaction piece to these things, is you want to make sure that you're checking not only the bias of the potential authors, but your own bias. Sometimes we see headlines or we see articles that we automatically disagree with, so we discredit it. We want to make sure that we're remaining open to that. It's that quote I had in the beginning about answer nothing. It's much better to just go in kind of with that open mind, and you can still have your own thoughts and opinions, but you just want to make sure that you're leaving space for that other side of an argument or that other opinion. This is really important when we are doing research around potentially controversial topics, potentially topics that are still kind of being figured out as well. So it's really important to make sure that you are aware of your own biases in your research. My very last thing I always like to recommend, if you're ever not sure, ask the experts. That could be, of course, us here at SCAD Libraries. That could be your professors. That could even be your classmates or friends. If you found that tweet about the tweet about the Tetris blocks and you thought it was weird, ask your friends. See if anyone else has that kind of same opinion as you. That can be a really great way to have a kind of fun but intellectual discussion around something. So really just kind of ask around, ask those experts, ask the people in your life. But this really is something that I think takes a little bit of practice and you have to hone it a little bit. So it's not always super straightforward and it really does take practice. So I have an example too, because sometimes I've talked a lot about those newspaper articles, those journal articles, but especially at a school like SCAD, we're thinking of things like images, we're thinking of graphs, we're thinking of data visualization. So I have an example of an infographic that I thought we could kind of talk to, and I want to draw your attention to a couple things. But first, I'm just going to throw it up on our screen. This is a report from Apple Maps. It's their mobility trends report. You can see from its little description, this is the COVID-19 era. So I want to give y'all a little bit of time to kind of think about this. And if you need me to read any of it, I know it's a little small potentially on your screens, but this is the mobility trends, the change in routing requests since January 13 of 2020. So you can see that January is up here. March is that big drop here. And the reddish pink is for driving, the orange is for walking, and the purple is for public transportation. So I am wondering if anyone, and I have the chat open here in case you want to share your thoughts. Is anyone having any thoughts around how to interpret this data or why this data might have been tracked? Or even do you have questions about, I don't understand this graph, what does this even mean? That's also a great and valid question.
And this is just referring to the amount of people who use Apple Maps, right?
Yeah, so that's kind
Like, of
of,
course, it drops off because nobody's going anywhere. So that's, you know, and then it just creeps back up, and then we're back to full traffic.
yeah. So I like what you said about it drops off because nobody's going anywhere. Do you remember, and this is, I said New York City, do you think people stayed in their homes 24/7 during the pandemic?
No.
Yes, but that's kind of what this is showing, right?
There was, I mean, like in the beginning, I think a lot of us, we did just stay home because they were like, stay home, just don't go anywhere. You know, so we didn't. And then, and then we did.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any interpretations of kind of that large drop? I also kind of want to highlight that the terminology they're using is that this is change in routing requests since January 13th. Not necessarily, but then the title of it is mobility trends. Is that causing anyone to double think maybe around what they're trying to say?
So is it that they're sort of taking data about one thing about like what people are asking Apple Maps to do in terms of navigation and then claiming that it's actual movement?
Yeah, so they're kind of taking one type of information and making it seem like it's something else. So they've taken the number of routing requests for Apple Maps and are publishing it as how much people are moving. What is their mobility? The thing that I like to point out about this is that it's kind of misleading, right? I have a couple things on the next slide I like to talk to, which Virginia called out. It's tracking the data of people using Apple Maps, but it's not actually tracking the people's movements. But that report title, if you don't really think about it, makes it sound like they're tracking the movements of people. What's something that kind of came to my mind, if you remember in the pandemic when everything shut down, really the only kind of outlet some people had was the ability to walk around their neighborhood. Like they could go to the grocery store and back. That's basically all of our movements throughout the pandemic. So if we are going to our grocery store, we likely already know how to get there. So we're not using Apple Maps. And that's not really shown in this chart. That's not really described in this data in any way, but it makes it seem like all transportation stopped. It's not accounting for all of those people who are still working, those essential workers who are still going to those hospitals and going to their jobs, because those are the people who are not using Apple Maps. A potentially better alternative to this kind of data could be describing that people weren't traveling during the pandemic. You know, tourists are likely the ones who are using a lot of Apple Maps in New York City. So the fact that people weren't traveling during the pandemic, they weren't in New York on vacation, so they weren't using Apple Maps to navigate. So that's kind of my idea behind this little activity is even though we're getting this infographic, it's from Apple. They told us kind of how they got their data. and they put it in a very compelling visual format. Especially with infographics, though, we need to make sure that we are kind of questioning how this information might be displayed and what words they're using to describe it. It can get really overwhelming, I know, with some of these graphs with all of these numbers, and they kind of like go over each other a lot too. But you have to think critically. You have to really not just take everything with that first type of, oh, this is published by Apple. They did their kind of data research. That's a pretty well-known software company. I'm sure they're making charts and graphs that are up to date and all good. Something that's really interesting that I want to point out about this actual graph is that you can't find it anymore unless you go through the Internet Archive. They actually took down their mobility trend reports because they were a little misleading. It wasn't necessarily the best representation of their research and their publication. So that's something that you can no longer access. They did kind of retire these reports. And if you want to find them, you do have to kind of do a little bit of extra digging and find them in the Internet Archive. But I do want to thank y'all for kind of thinking around that with me. I know it can be kind of a tough example when there's just that one image and not necessarily the ability to explore that whole website. But something that I really want to highlight for if we are doing this type of research, or if we're just trying to also kind of fact check what we're finding in our media feeds or on the news and things like that, is I have a handful of resources that I wanted to demo a couple of them for you. But I have them listed out here. And of course, I'm going to highlight those SCAD resources. So things like our research guides are going to be very useful because they're created by the librarians here at SCAD Libraries. We review a lot of digital content and digital information for y'all, kind of vetting it beforehand for you. So if you find information through a research guide, you know it was put there by a librarian. So it has a little bit of that trustworthiness already to it. I also wanted to kind of call out to the fact that we do research consultations. So that ask an expert kind of idea behind evaluating sources. If you're ever struggling with this, really just set up that one-on-one appointment with one of us. I do them virtually over Zoom. They're also available in person, and it can be a great way to just get a little bit of extra help. And then I have just a handful of some of our databases. We subscribe to a ton of them. These are just a few kind of starting resources that I wanted to call to your attention if you are a little bit newer to research, that are going to be a little bit more objective and a little bit more academic in their focus. I also wanted to include some links for some fact-checking media sites. So these are quite a few. I'll show you one in particular that I find to be pretty entertaining to go through. But these are really great resources. If you see those headlines, or you see that tweet, or you kind of stumble across something on the internet that just seems really outlandish, these are sites that are going to be useful for you to kind of get that second opinion, potentially find the original source of it, and things like that. So what I'm going to do is open up, I think I'm back over here. And I'm opening up our SCAD Libraries homepage. It's a link in my SCAD, or you can just visit library.scad.edu. And the resource I really want to show you is from our databases collection. So to navigate to our databases, I just go to that centermost tab under search, and I go to that full database list. So there's a lot of ways to navigate this page. We do have some filters at the top you can use based off of subjects. So those are going to be our majors at SCAD as well as types. So you can see if we're looking for different types of information, images, ebooks, dictionaries, etc. But the one I want to show you is that CQ Researcher. And what I like about this resource is that it does a fairly good job of trying to be as unbiased as they can, but they specifically publish reports that are around some trending or potentially hot topics in a way. So this is a great place to go for information that presents both sides of an argument. I have a little tip, especially if you're someone who works off campus or isn't able to get to campus and you're trying to load these databases. Sometimes they don't load right away. I'm the type of person that has 20 tabs open at all times, probably more at this point. So if you want to open in a private window or incognito mode, it loads much faster just because it's not trying to compete with all those other browsers you have. So I'm going to go to the CQ Researcher part. And just like a library catalog, it starts off kind of with that search bar in the top over here. That's where we want to do some of that keyword searching if we have a topic we're interested in. They also have some of the most recent reports. And you can see from the titles, they're going to be kind of that hot topic piece. Regulating tech, college debt, foster care, gun control. So there's a lot of some of these things that are probably being talked about in the news a lot that can get overwhelming to do research on because you're getting all of those different opinions. Something that CQ Researcher does is dives really deep into those topics. So I think there was one for college debt. I'm going to click on this one. As an example, we have that abstract at the top, and we have a little table of contents on the side. So we can see that this one is talking kind of about that current situation. It was published pretty recently. Actually, that's very recently, just a couple months ago. And we're able to get all this information. This looks quite long. I see that little scroll bar on the side. And it's really, really useful to get those both sides of an argument. I want to click on another example. Something like regulating tech. If you see on the side now with their table of contents, it's a little bit longer. And the one I always like to point out is this pro and con section. So this is that idea of being able to get both sides of an argument. This is what I'm talking about when we're trying to think critically and question a topic, questions a person's point of view. If we're able to get multiple people's point of view, we're able to get that better picture around a topic. And they do a great job as well of giving you kind of that background information. So this is a great resource to use, especially if you're unfamiliar with a topic that you're kind of just starting to get interested in. I personally don't know too much about regulating tech, so I would definitely need to go in and read that background piece. But if I do go to pros and cons, there's a lot of quotes I can see here. Here we go. So this pro and con section, they specifically find experts in kind of this area of regulating tech, and they pose a question to them. So should social media platforms pay news outlets when their content is shared? That's a kind of interesting regulation point of view. So you can see that pro, it's who they reached out to. I can even see kind of their title and affiliation here. And you have that con as well. They even do a pretty good job of trying to probe you with those questions, kind of get your wheels turning a little bit. So CQ Researcher is one of my favorite resources to recommend when you are kind of in that starting phase. You're a little newer to a topic, and maybe you're trying to just get an overall idea about something. It's also really useful for kind of knowing what's being talked about. They do have those top resources, but you also can, of course, browse by different topics. Art and culture might be one that could be interesting to click into. They have it broken out this way too. So there's a lot of discoverability within this database as well. I also want to show y'all one of those fact-checking sites. So I pulled up Snopes. I'm not exactly sure how it's pronounced. But this is a really great resource that essentially finds all of those clickbaity titles or finds those trending things on social media and does a little bit of that work around figuring out if it's real or not. So they have kind of those latest at the top. They also do things for news and politics, which can be very useful. You can even see from this example here that there apparently is some Russian propaganda going around about Ukraine. So this is a great way to just kind of make sure that if you see those type of headlines, you question them and you can kind of fact check them. So if I click into this top featured one here, they make it really easy for you by breaking it down into what that claim was and kind of how they rated it. So this was actually an article that was published in a satire news site. So I've never heard of this news site. So I would never have assumed that it was satire. I might just automatically kind of be like, oh, I could see that being something that happened. I could just take that as kind of point blank information. But if I wanted to do my due diligence, this is a great site that makes it very easy for you to get that high level kind of, nope, this is satire. It was published on this date. You can access that article as well. So they even do a good job of making sure that you can do your own type of research if you wanted to. They have a little bit of that article, and they have some of that kind of chronological how this article got written. So the claim was made based off of something somebody posted on Facebook and Twitter. So this is a great way to kind of see how sometimes that information gets out there. Especially with social media, people can say a lot of things and they're joking and they think and assume that their followers know they're joking. But then it gets viral, more people see it, and then somehow it ends up on the news. So it's kind of interesting to follow this trajectory of some of this information and how it happens, which is why I'm really encouraging this idea of questioning things that you're reading, thinking critically, both about an author's point of view, the publisher's purpose and motivation to publish that article, thinking about these publishers' missions, intended audiences. There's a lot of different ways to kind of approach this, but ultimately it's kind of about trusting your gut. And it's about doing your due diligence and following up on these resources. You want to make sure that it's something that you can comfortably say, either that's through going through their citations or checking that author, that this is something that I believe is truthful and I believe is trustworthy, or you're using it as an example, like I did in this PowerPoint, of things that might be satire, things that might be misinformation. So I'll take us back to just that PowerPoint, and I will share these slides with everyone who attended as well, in case you want to have these links. But again, we have a lot of resources at SCAD libraries to help you kind of navigate this information overload that we have nowadays of all this information on the internet available to us and how to navigate it and find what is going to be the most useful for any of your projects, whether that is that academic paper where you're reading those journal articles, or sometimes we are doing some of that data visualization and we want to make sure that we're representing data in an ethical and understandable way. But that is everything I had for y'all today. So I wanted to say a thank you for everyone who joined, and I have our contact information up on the screen as well.